Most of us are being controlled or manipulated by corporations, religions, or political parties through the use and application of psychology. However, once you know what's going on, can see those patterns, you can take control back and stop being controlled and or manipulated. We'll talk about the 70-30 split on this episode of the Stressless Guru podcast. You're listening to the Stressless Guru podcast, where we stress less and live more. All music is original works composed and recorded by the Stressless Guru. Friends, family, fellow wanderers, welcome to Studio Zen. This is the Stressless Guru podcast. I am the Stressless Guru, and on my podcast, I like to look at life through a different lens. Examine the world around us, try to focus on the bigger, yet often unseen picture. So today I want to talk about this thing I call the 70-30 split. Now, just to put it out there into the open, it's not an exact 70-30. Here's the thing to keep in mind. What we're going to talk about is it's a documented, repeatable, well-known pattern of humanity. It's something that we all fall into to some degree. But the number is closer to 25 to 35% of us versus 65 to 75% of us, give or take a little bit. So I just kind of round it up, make it nice, pretty. 70-30 is a good, solid, constant number. And what do I mean by 70-30? So here's kind of the general concept. Let me just get it out there so you know what I'm talking about, and then we'll get into the specifics of it. So statistically speaking, and this is something, again, it can be reproduced in the laboratory. When we're talking about human psychology, about 70% of us will go along with a specific concept, a specific idea, whereas approximately 30% of us will say, you know what, that's not for me. There's nothing that you can do to really motivate me to join your little incentive, your little, whatever it is. 30% of us are like, nope, I'm good. 70% of us are like, sure, sign me up. Now, this flips depending on what it is. So if in marketing, I used to work at a bookstore, and we had specific programs. If I was to ask you, would you like to purchase this specific program, we'll send you, magazines or whatever the that month's item was that we were trying to sign people up for. About 70% of the people, because I'm asking you, I'm going to need your credit card information on file. I'm going to need you to sign this contract. This is how you can get out of the contract. Once you start bringing that into, your questioning of, hey, this is what I'm offering you, about 70% of the people were like, absolutely not, man. I appreciate you asking, but no. And then 30% of the time, or 30% of the people would say, sure, go ahead and sign me up. I'll take a look, and I'll remember to cancel. But if I was doing something where I'm not asking for a financial contribution, so say some kind of a incentive program or a points reward program. I remember when one of the gas stations around town started doing a reward program. You just come in, hey man, if you give me your email address and your phone number, I'll give you this card. Every time you come in, you get 5 cents off of the gas that you're putting into the vehicle. And you get reward points, so you can get free food, free drinks, whatever else, they packaged into it. It's not going to cost me anything. If anything, it's saving me money for their loyalty programs. So sure, 70% of us are going to be like, you know what? Sure, go ahead and sign me up for that. 30% of us are going to want nothing to do with it. So again, it depends on the situation, what group you fall into. Are you part of that 70% or are you part of that 30%? For instance, here's another group. 70% of the world population identify as sports fans. 30% of the world population don't. I happen to be in the 30% that are like, you know what, I'll watch sports. I couldn't tell you what teams are out there. I couldn't even tell you all of the different like sports or how many teams or like that's just not. It doesn't interest me. There are absolutely avid sports fans who are 100% in. Then you got some people on the outskirts that also compile that 70%. And again, that number gets kind of muddy towards the center there. So it could be about, somewhere in 65 to 75% of the people identify as sports fans. 25 to 35% don't, depending on when the numbers are being asked. We get close to a big bowl or a big sporting event, more people may say they identify than they would in the off season. So the numbers can fluctuate a little bit. And just because you're in 30% for one thing doesn't mean you're always in the 30%. You can't just look at a population and say, okay, you show me the 70% versus the 30%. That's not how that works. It's situationally based. It's dependent upon whatever it is that you're being asked to do. Now, they know this in corporations. Okay, so corporations actually take this information and use it against us. We've got things like social proof. If I say everyone else is doing it, I know as a corporation, if I can put that message out there, that about 70% of the population are going to want to be involved with everybody else. Hey, everybody else is doing it? Okay, fine. If everybody else is jumping off of a cliff, would you jump off a cliff? Statistically speaking, about 70% of us might. 30% of us would be like, you guys are crazy. So the statistics are there. We'll talk about seriously, man, 70% of the people would actually like jump off of the bridge. If they saw everybody else doing it, yes. That's statistically what we are seeing. Scarcity is another thing that's used by corporations. If I'm a corporation and I'm wanting to bump up my sales, if I put the words limited edition on something, I know 70% of the population is going to, or 70% of the people that are in my target group see the words limited edition and they're going to at least be tempted into making a purchase. 30% of the population or the group are going to say, you know what, nah, it's okay, I'll pass, I don't need it. I am in that 70%. This is one of the groups that I belong to. I am in that 70% of that says limited edition. I'm going to jump on it. Same thing with like if I'm trying to promote something, okay? 70% of the people watching a commercial who are sports fans, if I put a sports celebrity endorsing my product, think about this. Why do we see, I can't tell you the number of commercials I've seen with like a football star or a soccer star or a NASCAR driver endorsing a specific product. They may not even have any idea what the product itself is, but they will be paid a good paycheck to tell you, hey, this is the beverage of my choice. Whatever the commercial, the endorsement might be for. Marketing agencies will pay these celebrities to back a product because they know that a large percentage of the population will go along with that celebrity endorsement. Fear of missing out is another one. How many times have we heard FOMO? Okay, they're getting FOMO. That's a real thing, and 70% of the population are susceptible to the fear of missing out. So if I'm a marketing director working in marketing, and I know I can sell the fear of missing out. I'm not going to call it the fear of missing out, but I can word things. I can manipulate people into wanting to go to an event, into wanting to buy a product, into having an experience. Because if you don't jump on board now for this limited time offer, then you might miss out. So we can take from a corporate level and market people's desire, 70% of us desire to have that tribal connection. We want to be part of that in-group. And so just by being a person, psychology has been tested. we have been tested in psychology, I should say, and it has been found that about 70% of us will go along with what's being pushed at us. Think about clothes. I was thinking about this the other day. As clothing trends come and go, how many of us are actually like, yeah, I'm going to be the trend setter? You're not the trend setter. You're the guy that went and bought, or the woman that went and bought the thing that some corporate head, big head, is like, hey, this is the new style that I'm going to push. I remember years ago, bell bottoms were coming back in style. And this was something that was around in the 70s, 60s, 70s. And then you started seeing them again in the late 90s, early 2000s, where people were wearing these large, big bell-bottom pants. And I remember hearing the adults around me complaining, oh my gosh, they're not that style. It's not coming back. The people wearing them weren't designing the bell-bottoms. They didn't ask somebody to create bell-bottoms for them. Corporations started putting these out there, knowing that there was a percentage of people that were going to see them and jump on board with that specific look. So corporations are making the decisions for us and then selling us the illusion that we have a choice in this, in the matter. But it's not just corporations. Political organizations know this as well. They don't need to get 100% buy-in on any specific thing. They just need the majority of the group, the 70% to buy in. And then the 30%, they can just, they can take a hike. That's fine. They'll do their own thing. As long as I've got the 70%, I can get my way. And it becomes kind of a dangerous situation when you think about it. We don't necessarily have complete control because we've got the 70% that are willing to just go along with it. There were a couple scientists, psychologists, that did some experiments back in the 50s on this very thing. So Solomon Asch was a psychologist, and in the 1950s, he did a conformity experiment where he brought a group of people in and told the group, hey, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring in an outsider from our group and see if they will go along with the group. So I'm going to show you some images on the screen, and then I want you to give me I'm going to ask you which of these matches the other series of images. Give me the wrong answer. But everybody pick the same wrong answer, and then we'll see if the person that's outside of our group, that doesn't know that they're outside of our group, but we're going to see if they will go along with the group and also give us the wrong answer, or if they will stand independently of the group and give the correct answer. And it was very interesting. So I'm talking about this 70-30 split. Approximately 32% were fooled the majority of the time. Okay? So a small percentage were fooled most of the time and went along with the group, giving the wrong answers, even though very clearly they could see they were giving the wrong information. It's just they didn't want to stand out from the crowd, which is pretty hopeful because the majority were like, nah, you guys are nuts. 70% approximately were like, I'm not falling for this. However, okay, so good on them. But 75% of the people conformed to the wrong answer, giving into peer pressure at least once. So we had everybody that came in, and 75% of the time, they would at least once go along with the group. They would question what they were seeing. They would question their lying eyes and say, you know what? Okay, I know that what I'm seeing is not what they're saying, but maybe I'm wrong. So sure, we'll go with their answer. They caved to peer pressure and gave the wrong answer. Stanley Milgram, another psychologist, he kind of took it a little bit darker, and in his experiments, He wanted to see about people listening to a figure of authority. And so he had participants come in, and basically there were two participants, and one of them was like in on what was going on. The other one had no idea. They were just there for, to help out with the experiment. And the whole process was, and you should look up the experiment. It's very, very interesting. But essentially, one person would be set in front of a board with some knobs on it, and the other person would be put in a separate room. The person in the separate room would be the quote-unquote student, and then the person sitting at the board with the knobs on it was the teacher. The person that was playing the teacher would ask a series of questions, and if the student got it wrong, then the teacher was instructed to turn a knob, and it would send an electric charge, shocking the student. And on the board, it went all the way up to 450 volts that was marked with an XXX, indicating that this could be a lethal amount of electricity. The only other factor in this was the person conducting the experiment, quote unquote, and they were there to make sure that if the person turning the knobs had any questions, they could, refer back to the experimenter. 65% of the people were willing to go all the way to the maximum number, the lethal amount of electricity. And oftentimes they weren't, they were visibly not comfortable doing it, but they were agreeing to and would, because the experimenter kept saying, it's part of the experiment, just continue to go, please continue to ask your questions. And the person in the other room, the actor, would scream and shout, and I don't want to do this anymore. I want to get out. And so the person that was playing the teacher would, hey, this guy's really struggling in there. Should we stop? Should we check on him? The instructor would just calmly say, no, please continue with the experiment. And they would. And 65% of the people sat in the chair were willing to go all the way to the lethal amount of electric shock. We see this with the bystander effect as well. Between 60 and 70% of the people witnessing a violent crime will just stand by and watch it happen. How many times have we seen on the internet where a group of people are standing around witnessing something happen, and all they're doing is recording it on their phones? Nobody's calling the police. Nobody's stepping in to intervene. Nobody is doing anything to help the victim. They're just standing there recording, watching, onlookers, being bystanders. Which kind of makes me nervous anytime I'm out. I'm aware of the psychology of people and the psychology of groups. And so I know if something happened and I was reliant on strangers to intervene, 60 to 70% of the people that witness what's happening are just going to stand there and let it happen or walk on by. And that's just the statistical truth. In the right setup, whether it's following somebody that we perceive to be an authority, and in the case of the Stanley Milgram, where the people were willing to go all the way up to the 450 volts, which would have killed the person in the other room, and they were like, okay. They perceived responsibility to be on the person in authority. So they were willing to go along with what the person in authority, and it was just a student in a lab coat. Like, they kept it pretty generic. Stanley Milgram was curious why, this was shortly after World War II, why the people of Germany sat back and just let the atrocities that were happening happen. It's because 65 to 70% of the people just let it happen. So whether it's following what somebody in perceived authority is telling us, an officer, a politician, a doctor, a religious figure, if it's social proof, fear of being the odd man out, fear of standing out, roughly 65 to 75% of us will comply, which leaves the other 25 to 35% of us there to be the resistance. And you see, the problem with this is when we go and look at like religious institutions, for instance. This is something I used to work. I've worked at a number of churches, and something that we were aware of, the 70-30 split. We didn't have it like scientifically, we didn't call it like 70-30, but we knew we've got the majority of the congregation is in our back pocket. If we need something, even if they disagree with us, which is kind of sick when you think about it, even if they knew what we were saying or trying to push was wrong, 70% of the congregation would not say anything against it. They would just, I don't agree, but okay, I don't care. It was that 30% that we knew would have the problem. So we, instead of dealing with it as a large group, we would break us up into house groups where it's, if you've got 1,000 people in a congregation and you're one of the 30%, it's kind of easy to just hide away. They're not going to see me. I'm fine. I don't agree with it, but this is church, this is where I go. So, okay, whatever. If I'm in a house group and there's only 10 of us, it's a lot harder to hide. So I can sway by putting us, by breaking the congregation up into house groups, I can sway more of that 30% who are standing up against whatever it is we're trying to push. I can sway them into that, the bigger group by using peer pressure. It's just, it's statistically sound. I mean, it works. We can take that 30% and chisel away some of it. So instead of having that 30% standing out, maybe it's only 25% of the of the congregation that's now no longer, because I was able to break us up in smaller groups and pull some of that 30% over into my 70% of the group. Politicians do this. They know that if they can get 70% to back whatever it is they're saying, well, then the 30% they can go off and, fine, you don't have to vote. You don't have to get involved. You don't have to be active. That's fine. But I've got the 70% in my back pocket. And then we can leverage that 70% against the 30%. We call the 30% heretics. We call the 30% sinners. We call the 30% uneducated. And the people in the 70% oftentimes are so dedicated to the 70% that they will stand up and defend it violently if they have to. They won't allow people to question them because they're in the majority. And if they're in the majority, then you've got to be wrong. 30% of us are like, you know what? I will take that. I will take the risk of being wrong if it means I'm not conforming to the group think. We saw this play out in real time several years ago. Look at the statistics of the number of people who, just like we saw in the conformity experiment that Solomon Asch conducted back in the 1950s. We had the same experiment played out on a global scale. How many people, at least once, were willing to go along with the group think, with the group mentality? We knew, and we heard this number. I mean, it was all over the place. If we can get 70% herd immunity, we will be fine. If you go and Google today, the percentage of people who were willing to go through and get at least one injection, 70%. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it is. And those who are in charge of us in our corporate worlds, in our political worlds, in our religious worlds, they are aware of having that 70% and the amount of peer pressure that they can impose upon others in the 30%. And they'll use that 70% against the 30% to try to get that 30% over. So you can whittle that 30% down to the 25% who are rock solid against whatever the thing is, maybe we can move 5% more over to our side. It's interesting. I literally looked up the statistics, and I want to say, see if I can find it here real quick. It was like right at 70.6% of the population got at least one of the injections that we were trying to push several years ago. It was very interesting that, sure, we could say, 70% of the population in the United States is Christian, or 70% of us live paycheck to paycheck, or 70% of us are homeowners, 70% of us are in a committed romantic marital relationship. But when you start looking at, okay, sure, that's just kind of how the numbers fall. But when it's being used against us, it's weaponized against us. And we don't even realize it because unless you're aware of the 70-30 split, you don't know which group you might be in. You just think that, hey, I'm independent in my decision-making here, and this is where I stand. However, if you know the 70-30 and are aware that corporations, politicians, and religious figures are also aware of the 70-30 split, and they will use it to their advantage, weaponizing it against us. Now we're in a situation where we are susceptible to being controlled because they know 70% of us are going to give in to peer pressure. So it's just having that awareness. Again, like I said, if somebody slaps limited edition on something, I'm in the 70% that's like, I'm going to own 2 of those items. Thank you very much. And I'm aware that I'm part of that 70%. But when you sit and have a conversation with people who think, yeah, hey, listen, I'm an independent thinker. People aren't controlling my thoughts. And then you learn about the psychology of marketing and the psychology of groupthink, the social psychology, and how we identify with our peers. Most of us want to fit in with the peer group, even when we know what we are doing is wrong, because we want to be part of that bigger group. Sometimes it's out of fear. Sometimes it's because we have not educated ourselves enough on whatever is being said or whatever is going on, and we just take for granted that those in what we presume to be authority figures have our best interest at heart. But you can't make those assumptions, because I used to make those assumptions, and I have personally been burnt by people that I thought were in authority over me. Okay, well, this is what they're saying to do. I'm going to take it at face value what they said and go along with it, and then I got burnt. And because I went along with what they said without questioning it, and I got burnt, I was the one left holding the bag. Now that I'm aware of the psychology of the 70-30, and I can see how people are being manipulated, I can make those decisions for myself. Do I want to be part of that 70%? I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being part of the 70%. Sometimes the 70% have the right idea and they know exactly what's going down. So it's good to follow that group. But you also want to step back and think, if I'm following the group, where is the group going? Do I need to be part of that 30%? And the 70-30, it's not universal. Okay, just putting it out there, it wavers a bit. It is dependent on the situation. Sometimes it's good to be part of that 30% and stand up and say, you know what? This isn't easy to stand in opposition of what's going on, but it's what I need to do. I don't buy into what all is being pushed onto the group. So let's talk about what this is and what this isn't. So what this is a recurring pattern in human behavior under social pressure, authority, or persuasive setups. Approximately 60 to 75% of us tend to comply or go along, okay, the compliant majority, Whereas 25 to 40% of us will push back, be the resistance, the independent minority. In practice, it's a useful statistical target. It's a performance benchmark that corporations use. I want you to sign up for our email distribution. 70% of the people that come through your line. Ask 100% of the people, 70% should sign up. 30% we expect to say no. Flip side, I'm offering you a credit card. You're going to have to pay interest, and it's pretty high interest rates. Do you want to sign up? 30% will say yes. 70% will say no. In sales and retail, teams are asked to hit that 70% because it's achievable, but it does take some work. It's a pattern. Marketing, politics, religion, they're designed around the expectation that most people will default to compliance when the conditions are right. Again, the psychological roots here. It's backed by classic studies showing majority compliance within that 65 to 75% ballpark under specific setups. For Asch, in his conformity experiment, around 75% conformed at least once, averaging 32% per trial. Stanley Milgram, in his experiment on obedience to authority, baseline 65% went all the way to the max, which would have gone into that lethal territory and would have killed the person in the other room. Now, in case I didn't say it, just the person in the other room never got shocked. Like the machine itself did not produce electricity. The only shock that ever happened was the person actually turning the knobs. They gave them a very low shock just so they could buy into the illusion that this was real. So they would actually give them a shock. But the person that was shouting for help, saying that, I don't want to do this anymore, we're doing this against my will, they were never in harm. There's actually a really good film about this called The Experimenter. Highly recommended if this is something you're interested in. Really good film. Kind of gives the whole picture. 70% of all humans will obey, will conform. Again, percentages will shift based on the context, proximity to the victim, the perceived legitimacy of the authority figure, personal stakes, our cultures come into play, even how what we're being asked is framed can skew those numbers. In some of Milgram's variations, obedience dropped down to 20 to 30%. In others, it went as high as 90%. Herd immunity. Okay, we talked about this a little bit ago with how many people were willing to go and get that first initial injection. It's not always 70%. When it comes to like measles, for instance, we had approximately a 95% buy-in. Polio, 80%. If you do a quick Google search, you'll see that we're sitting right around 70. I think it's like 70.6. I don't have the numbers right up in front of me right here. But if you do a quick Google search, you'll be able to see this. Social pressure helps sway the minority into the majority, but it's not always with certainty. Sometimes, as we saw several years ago when it came to the injection, there were people who were absolutely defiant. They dug their heels in, and it does not matter what you say, what you do. In fact, the more you try to push, the more you're pushing me away. And that's something that gets factored into these numbers as well. What this isn't a hard universal statistic applied to every person in every single situation. It's not 70% of all humans always obey no matter what. Percentages will, again, shift. It's also not proof that most people are sheep or morally weak. It's completely situational. The low pressure when people are resistant, okay, the numbers can sway. Bottom line for all of this is the pattern is real enough and consistent enough that smart systems, our corporations, our political parties, our religious institutions know that they don't need 100% buy-in, just the compliant majority. But it is flexible. You could have 70% of the people buy in. This is something that happened one of the churches early on in the late 90s, I should say, or early on for me in my young adulthood when I was trying to figure out what life was going to be like. I saw a church that was growing leaps and bounds. We had that 70% was in our back pocket. They were willing to go all the way with whatever we decided we wanted to do. They were there with us. And then slowly, as the leadership started to crumble and the cracks started to show and people started seeing, hey, maybe this isn't exactly what I was thinking it was, people started to sway. About 70% of the church wound up leaving. The other 30% became the majority, and within that group, there was division. The numbers flipped. It was flexible. Just because you have the majority now doesn't mean you're always going to have that majority in your back pocket. Groups change. Things can sway the group one way or the other. Awareness lets you train yourself and others to slide into that resistant 30% more often. Again, there's nothing wrong with being part of that 70%. Nice thing about, 70% of the world population identifies as sports fans. That's great. We find family in there. We find community in that 70%. We find bonds of friendship that can be very, very tightly forged. It's okay. 70% of us like sports, like the thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's knowing who's in control, who's calling the shots, and am I being controlled against my will? Do I need to be in that 30%? And that's the empowering part, is because once you know the 70-30 split, once you start seeing majorities and minorities and how they're interacting with each other and how psychology is being brought into play and being used by the corporations, the religious institutions, and the politicians against us or to control and manipulate us, you can then say, hey, I see what's going on here, and I don't want any part of that. I don't know if you can hear my dog snoring, but she's somewhere in here, and she is absolutely out cold. Hopefully, the microphone isn't picking her up, and hopefully I have not put you to sleep like I put my dog to sleep. But if I have, hey, I mean, at least you're relaxed enough to drift off, and hopefully if you are asleep, you're getting some decent rest. All right, well, that's what I've got for you for today's show. Hopefully you found it a little bit intriguing, a little bit interesting. I know I wasn't no deep breathing or anything like that on this episode. It was really about, in my opinion, part of my philosophy as the Stressless Guru is, sure, being zen, being, in the moment and balancing life and everything in moderation. That's breathe, meditation. That's all good. And I support that. But one of the biggest pieces of living a stress-free life is being educated and being able to step back and look at the bigger picture, because so often we get so focused on the small, tight, compact picture of life, and it really has nothing that we need to stress about when we step back and see the bigger picture and see, what, actually, in the big scheme of things, is this little moment really that big of a deal? When you step back, sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, and I'm not discounting that. But a lot of times the things that we allow ourselves to be stressed about are things we really should not be stressed about. The things that we should be stressed about rarely get our attention. It's the small stuff that we're focused on that stresses us out. And these institutions know that, and they will keep us focused on the very, very small things to keep us in that 70%. that are willing to be controlled and manipulated. All right. Well, friends, family, fellow wanderers, if this podcast has helped you stress a little less, think a little different, or feel a little less alone, then it's doing exactly what it's meant to do. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't. In this space, we are all welcome to be who we are, and I'm glad you're here. If you're listening to this on the audio-only version in a podcast, just know that the full video version is also available on YouTube. Just search for the Stress Less Guru. It's not super exciting. I sit here in front of a microphone, look at my notes on a screen, and just ramble. Wherever you're headed, truly, know that there is no need to rush. I am the Stress Less Guru, and until next time, stress less and live more.